So tonight I'm talking about figures that have lurked in the darkness for the past 2 centuries. These are things that kept people up at night, the shapes that were born of the darkness and retreated back into the darkness. These are the forces that preyed upon active imaginations. They also preyed upon property and unchaperoned women. My focus tonight are 3 types of nocturnal ne'er-do-wells: arsonists, ghosts, and cloakmen. Each has a vivid history in this town, and we should study the enemy in order to prepare for him. I tested this out with students today. They told me to hold those stares a little too long. So, first, arsonists, or incendiaries as they were called in the 19th century. Historians have typically studied arson as a political, economic, or terroristic tool. The historian Kathy Frierson has studied arson in late imperial Russia and observed that suspicious fires were a part of everyday life for Russian peasants. She argues that the alarming spike in arson cases in Russia in the 1870s and 1880s was due to misguided fire insurance policies. This is when I hold that stare. The payout for complete loss was often 2 to 3 times the value of a cottage or a barn. So Frierson notes, because of this system, peasants were able to benefit greatly from burning down their own houses. As we'll see, there's a connection to the pattern between this pattern and the Susquehanna Valley. The phenomenon of rural arson, semi-rural arson in 19th century United States has also attracted scholarly interest. In a study of 217 arson cases in 2 counties in western Georgia, between 1870 and 1900. Is that specific enough? The historian Albert Smith found that arson rates correspond to economic ups and downs. In the major recessions of the 1870s and 1880s, there were much higher rates of arson in western Georgia. 62% of the targets of these arson attempts or successful arsons were agricultural outbuildings. Barns, cotton gins, sheds, stables, warehouses. These were the mainstays of the farm economy. Smith quoted a newspaper editor from Dawson, Georgia in 1871, quote, it is a difficult matter to bring to justice the demon who puts the torch to a building under cover of night. Turning our attention to Selinsgrove, we find that arsonists or incendiaries were active. The editors of local newspapers were convinced at various points in the late 19th century that Selinsgrove was home to serial arsonists lurking in the shadows, fingers on the match. A survey of just some of these suspicious fires in the area suggests the depth of the activity. 2 barns burned in Middle Creek Township in April 1860. George Snyder's barn burned more locally in April 1861. He rebuilt by October of that year, and that barn burned to the ground 2 weeks later. The bridge at Cants burned in September 1871. A mud barge burned on a canal in December 1871. As a student said today, mud barges don't just burn. Of course, the great fires of 1872 and 1874 took out large swaths of the town. By late 1874, when Selinsgrove had suffered 2 catastrophic fires in 3 years, it was reported that town residents lived in fear of another blaze. In the 3rd week of December, a fire burned down the Hummel sawmill. Lewis Hummel was one of the wealthiest merchants in the Susquehanna Valley. He was a frequent plaintiff in county court, and he was the chief burgess. The glow of his burning mill could be seen in Sunbury. It was a total loss. The Lewisburg Chronicle's editor observed, "The fire, as usual, was the work of incendiaries." The following week, a fire blazed in John App's stable, 1 block off Market Street. It was put out, but a fire was discovered in the same stable 4 days later. That one spread to the stable of the First National Bank before it was doused. The Lewisburg Journal reported that Selinsgrovers spent sleepless nights in fear of the fire fiend, and that the town seemed, quote, doomed to annihilation. This was all in December of 1874. It's significant, I think, that this was the railroad era in town. The Sunbury and Lewistown Railroad had gone in a few years earlier, and commentators in Selinsgrove argued that the train made it far too easy for bad outsiders to come to town. The arson of the 1870s was blamed on all kinds of people, but one of the thinly veiled arguments was that outsiders were trying to damage the town for kicks, basically, just for entertainment. The Sunbury Gazette reported that several offices in town had received letters by people who threatened to put Selinsgrove to the torch. Again, December 1874. There was a great excitement prevailing, the Gazette noted, and if the villains should be caught, then lynch law will be put in force. The Juniata Sentinel said that the citizens had organized a secret vigilance committee. Business owners paid private watchmen to keep a lookout. 40 revolvers were sold in Selinsgrove during the 2 weeks after those December fires. 2 final examples of the glut of suspicious fires were 1877 and 1884. In February 1877, the railroad bridge spanning the river burned, and it was thought to be set intentionally. 8 of the bridge's 16 spans were destroyed. The fire was detected about 8 o'clock in the evening on a Saturday. No one was ever charged. Then, 3 months later, a young man walking through town at 3 a.m. on a Monday morning noticed a fire burning inside the photography studio on Pine Street near the bridge. He alerted a few neighbors, and they put the fire out quickly. This was an interesting case, this photography studio, because they stopped the fire before the evidence of foul play was all destroyed. The constable found a pile of boxes and straw in a corner on the ground floor, and the pile had been doused in coal oil. The floorboards of the second story had been soaked in coal oil, and the incendiary had hung an all oil-soaked bedsheet from the second floor railing down to the first floor to draw the fire up. It would have brought down the building. No one was ever charged. And then in April 1884, someone cut the bell rope that was used to call out fire companies. Then that person or persons apparently set a fire in the stable of Jacob Shuck on the alley to the west of Market Street at Walnut. That fire spread to the barn of the Shuck Brothers warehouse. That was a warehouse for a general store. The blaze was stoked by high winds and swept up the alley between Walnut and Pine. 20 outbuildings were destroyed. While Selinsgrove was up in arms, thinking that another great fire was about to break out, somebody robbed houses on the north side of town. Theories abounded. One of the major political issues of the day was the sale of alcohol. For some anti-saloon advocates, the fires of the 1870s and 80s were warnings sent to vocal supporters of the temperance movement. That's just an added fire. I don't know if that's a fake fire. One more fire, bonus. H.C. Iyer, blurry map here, but H.C. Iyer is south of the racetrack, basically, down here. H.C. Iyer's barn burned around Thanksgiving 1871, and Franklin Wyrick of the Selinsgrove Times blamed the wet faction in the county. They were sending him a message to stop trying to get judges to reject liquor licenses, he said. Wyrick went even further than that and said that if that wasn't the case, if they weren't set by booze people, then a great many Snyder County fires were due to one of 4 sources. So his first guess was booze people. Secondly, manufacturers of steam fire engines, he said, must be sending hirelings out across the region to set fires and make their products high demand. Or fire insurance agents were doing the same in order to stoke their business. Or carpenters were doing the same to make their business. Or finally, Weyrich said fire companies were setting fires to justify their existence and to convince town fathers to spend money on new fire engines. Of course, there were more basic explanations for frequent fires in a world where open flames were still the primary way in which people illuminated their lives. The editor, Oliver Warden of the Louisburg Chronicle, asked how many fires that are deemed mysterious or the work of an incendiary are the result simply of carelessness. John Youngman of the Sunbury Gazette got more specific. He believed that three-quarters of the barns destroyed in the valley in the 1870s were accidentally set on fire by pipe-smoking farmhands, he said. Youngman noted, there's not much difference between having a horse thief around the stable and a man cleaning off horses with a pipe in his mouth. And with that, I move on to my second figure in the darkness. Local German culture of the 18th century tended to support the idea that ghosts do exist, and that ghosts were people who did not sin enough during their life to go to hell, but did sin enough to be barred from immediate entry into heaven. So ghosthood was a type of purgatory in the view of many German settlers to these parts. But that traditional view of ghosts, paperwork issue, that traditional view of ghosts mixed with the terror that came from run-ins with Native Americans who did not want Europeans, particularly squatting Europeans, living on this side of the river. So the ghosts that were said to inhabit this area were a mixture of troubled spirits waiting to be saved and menacing spirits wreaking revenge on those who had encroached. An example of the former type comes from the decades before the Civil War. This was a time when gambling and drinking were coming under heavy fire from moral reformers. This seems to be a theme of many of my talks, right? Anti-drinking. The concept of delirium tremens had recently been popularized, and so people who were known as inebriates were often associated with delirium tremens, shaking. Alcohol and gambling went hand in hand in many reformers' minds. So DT symbolized bad marks on one's character. Newspaper editors framed a trio of suicides that took place in the 1850s in the valley as a temperance lesson for their readers. A man in Danville drowned himself in the river. A man in Louisburg took poison. A man from Freiburg hanged himself. They were all presented as people turned ghosts, spirits that would haunt this area for years to come. They were all presumed to be drinkers. And for newspaper writers, the shaking of their bodies, the rattling of chains, the scraping of their bones, etc., was a direct link between their delirium tremens and the behavior of ghosts. The man from Freiburg, by the way, was John Kantz. He hanged himself because he was apparently distraught that his adult son, George Kantz, had failed in business on the Isle of Kew. So the ghost of John Kantz was said to float the path between Freiburg and the river. Sometimes it was said to float the path from the river to Middleburg, for at the time of his father's suicide, young George was in the Snyder County Jail for forgery charges. An example of the second type of ghost, the Native American connection, comes from High Hill. High Hill is the ridge that runs west from Penns Creek by the Penn Avon campground on through Salem. Hill End is the east end of High Hill, and it was thought to be haunted. The story goes that at some point in the late 18th century, Native Americans went marauding on scattered farmsteads. This could have been during Pontiac's Rebellion or perhaps during the French and Indian War. The Indians stole a fat hog from a farm along Penns Creek and then took it to the area of App's Woods to roast it. On Christmas night for decades to come, a ghostly Native American spirit was said to run the entire length of High Hill, screaming in a blood-curdling fashion. More ominous, perhaps, was another shape said to roam the east end of High Hill. This was a huge black dog without a head. The beast was never named. It never got a cool moniker like the High Hill Hellhound. But it was apparently seen quite often in the early 19th century. Here's what you might experience if you came across this beast. A man on a bicycle in the late 19th century, so the 1890s had a bicycle craze attached to them. This guy was riding a bike along Penn's Creek. He was pedaling along the road by the creek one night when he came across a massive dog standing in the middle of the road. It was coal black and absolutely silent. The man dismounted and positioned the bike between him and the creature. After what seemed like minutes, the shape moved quietly off to the west, up a 70-degree slope. What struck the man most, more than the fact that the beast was headless, was that it made no noise as it climbed up through the brush. Another run-in with the dog came at the old cider mill that was right across from what is now Penn Avon Campground. A woman named Maria Stahl was walking down the road after sunset and was attacked by something. She called it a heavy being. It landed on her back, grabbed her by the shoulders, and strangled her from behind. She made it to her front gate with this thing on her back, and it promptly disappeared into the woods again without a sound. This beast closely resembled European tales of ghostly black dogs that had for centuries represented the devil in animal form. Black Shuck was perhaps the best known of these legends. Here's how a writer from the north of England described Black Shuck. This is a picture of Black Shuck. He really doesn't look that menacing, right? Maybe a little annoying. Here's Black Shuck. He takes the form of a huge black dog and prowls along dark lanes and lonesome field footpaths. He occasionally leaves his head behind him at home. His footfalls make no sound. Scoffers at Black Shuck, there have been plenty. But now and again, one of them comes home late on a dark night with terror on his ashen face, and after that, he scoffs no more. In the early 20th century, Selinsgrove resident Foster Kramer said that he encountered the dog as well. Kramer was the son of a Monroe Township farm laborer. When he was a child, he said he was sitting on the front porch of Fisher's schoolhouse. This is where JB's Pizza is today, on Park Road. There was a religious revival happening inside, and Kramer was just outside, sitting on the front porch. A huge black dog rounded the corner of the building and moved to the door. The door opened, and the dog entered. Foster Kramer said he waited a while and then went into the school too to see what the dog had done to the people inside. When he got in there, he saw nothing but the people at the revival. Folks in Selinsgrove spoke of the haunted landscape in the hinterland around town. Just outside of Crotzerville, they said an old derelict barn that had been used as a band hall was home to unsettled spirits. A man had killed himself by hanging from the rafters. Walking past that barn on a dark night, they said one might hear a spectral concert happening inside. The band would play and play, but if one peered in, the barn was empty. It should be noted that many of these witnesses to the ghostly shapes in the night were men walking home after a night drinking in local taverns. And last and probably least is in the ghost category are the spirits that SU students say haunt their campus. I'll go through these quickly. There are tales of a faceless girl of Seibert Hall. Sometimes it's the faceless girl of Weber Chapel. There were the 3 children of Peter Bourne, John, Ida, and Sarah. All died of diphtheria in 1862 and 1863. They were said to haunt Seibert or maybe Weber Chapel. An old woman who loved books haunts the library. And Lillian Smith, wife of the college president, is said to haunt Pine Lawn. Our final category of nighttime threat tonight is the cloak man or cloak men. Sometimes it's multiple, sometimes the concept is the same thing, just a singular cloak man. It was a loose term for a prowler after dark. And this is a Susquehanna Valley homemade product. This term is not used elsewhere for this thing. So this is an interesting local take on weirdos at night. The view of the cloak man shifted from an unknown dangerous force to a social nuisance between 1860 and 1930. The danger of a cloak man came from the fact that he operated at night and usually seemed to target women when they were alone on the streets. Let's take a closer look beneath the cloak. In this area, the story of the cloakman began as news coverage of what was happening down south. South central Pennsylvania was the home of the original cloakman. In January 1865, Lancaster was beset. A man in a cloak was seen in all the shadowy parts of town each night for 2 weeks and then went away. The Lancaster Express noted that he had been encountered annually for at least 20 years. No one could remember when it started, but a shadowy figure wearing a cloak at night seemed to have been around for a while. In the past, before the Civil War, some said that he emitted sparks from under his cloak. People claimed to have seen it themselves. But now, in 1865, the main way that the cloak man unnerved people was by exposing himself to women. On Wednesday, January 25th, 1865, a woman was closing up her sewing shop in Lancaster when the cloak man appeared. He flashed her and then slowly left. On January 28th, John Jacob Hogg was picked up for drunken and disorderly conduct in Lancaster. He was, as the Lancaster Daily Intelligencer described him, an odd-looking specimen of humanity. He was apparently too big to be the cloak man, but except for that, his size, he looked like the description. And when he was arrested that evening, he had been trying door handles on Goose Street. He said he needed a place to stay on a bitterly cold night. That spring, May 1865, Columbia, about 10 miles to the west, also had a run-in with a cloak man. 10 years later, 1875, Columbia suffered through a few more weeks of cloakman activity. In April 1878, a cloakman appeared to two women at 11 p.m. on 4th Street in Lancaster again. He tried to talk them into an alleyway before he was chased away by passers-by. The Daily Intelligencer, again of Lancaster, said, "It's time the cloakman caught a bullet." Middletown had a cloakman in November 1878. Lancaster got him again in December 1880. That month, 4 Lancaster men caught the cloakman. It turned out to be a young man of a wealthy family. They stripped him and made him stand outside the post office for an hour. He begged to be freed, promised never to do it again. The following year, the Columbia cloakman returned. It's working its way slowly up the valley, chasing a woman to the front door of her house. In February 1882, a cloakman in Columbia hit a woman over the head with a stick. Later that spring, 3 cloakmen were operating simultaneously in Lancaster. They were all injured in separate incidents on the same night. So it could certainly be said in Lancaster at least, by the late 1880s, the concept of the cloakman had lost any kind of sinister or spooky vibe and was now a generic term for prowlers or predators. By that summer, Lancaster papers were referring to the cloakman racket. It was in the summer of 1888 that Selinsgrove got its first cloakman. A man was seen hanging around the semi-abandoned canal at night and following women. Recognizing how these things got out of hand quickly, the Snyder County Times called for a tar and feather committee to be formed and to prepare themselves. This was a time when people out at night could be anything. They could be incendiaries. They could be drunken men stumbling home. They could be train saboteurs. They could be weirdos up to no good at all. That was the end of it. The cloakman of 1888 was never seen again. Across the river in Trevorton, a cloakman tried to carry away young women the next summer. In Lewisburg, the cloakman became a feature of the run-up to Halloween in the 1890s. Each October, it was reported that a cloakman was prowling about, chasing people, making strange noises. Sunbury got one in the winter of 1900. Then in November 1900, Selinsgrove came back into the cloakman game. Someone appeared on the streets late at night at Market Street near the rail crossing. Just up here. The figure stood still until someone came near, when he'd either move away if it was a man or a group, or move closer if it was a woman. Some wondered if it was the same man, a young man from Herndon who had been trying to move counterfeit money that week. That guy had been chased out of town by a few merchants. Had he come back to try to unsettle things? A sneak thief was scared away while trying to enter a blacksmith shop. Was this him? Ella Sparr's home was ransacked that month. A man was seen wandering near Wagon Seller's coal yard several nights in a row. What was he doing? John Booker had gold stolen from his house on Thanksgiving, of all days. That gold was later found wrapped in a handkerchief near the coal yard. Was it all connected? Cloakmen appeared in Selinsgrove a few more times over the next few years, and the last heyday of the cloakman was in the 1920s. In 1927, a cloakman stalked the streets in July. He passed under a street lamp close enough for witnesses to say that his cloak was black. They treated that was a big revelation. His cloak was black. A pair of women testified that he was wearing nothing under that cloak. But that was it for the cloakman of 1927. Public attention soon was diverted to a man in Middleburg who went on a mini stabbing spree among farm workers and had to be put on suicide watch in the county jail. This certainly didn't end the phenomenon of people with dark motives lurking in the night, but the local description of these people as cloakmen ended in 1927. After this, it would be prowlers and peeping toms for the rest of the century. Simpler times. As always, I have no good ending, so that is it. Thank you very much for listening to these tales of weirdos in the night.